Jacky, maybe if you guys.
I'll put it on that table. Yeah. Do you wanna?
Are you charging?
Yeah, please.
All right. So, well, I'm just gonna sit down. News is something which shapes the way people think and the way in which they engage with the world. That is why the sources they read is of particular importance, or otherwise what people who make misguided, misinformed decisions which do affect many other people beyond the scope of just their own lives. The first thing I'm going to do today is to do 3 pieces of setup. The first thing is to explain what does regional and international news look like beyond the examples given in the info slide. The first thing to note is that international news often covers world and global issues that make an attempt to cover everything, which is say in Economist, there's like a China, Africa, Latin America section. And as a result, they are very stretched thin to the extent that one issue will cover as many countries as they possibly can. And also, I think they often try to have editorials, they have opinions and discussions, and they weigh commentary and weigh in on issues which are happening and make commentary surrounding that. Compared to just the regional news, that focuses primarily on things which happen domestically, which is to say kind of local politics or whether federal politics, things like economic policy, which has just recently been passed through, things like maybe charitable endeavors, which a local hero has gone through. And importantly, I think there is less things like factional reporting. And when it comes to international news, there is this factional reporting or commentary on who has won the election. It would largely just be, well, Biden has won the election, or there is a conflict in Israel and Palestine at the moment, and there isn't much commentary on that. And there are 4 reasons to suggest why this is true. The first of which is that often people believe it is outside the scope of what they want to cover, because this is somewhat about local or domestic news as opposed to international news. Secondly, I think staff often feel like they lack expertise, which is to say, often to write for The Economist or The Guardian, you often also have an IR degree on the side to be able to make the commentary, as opposed to say in local news, often it's about journalism and how to cover issues in the objective way and disseminate that sort of information. The third thing is they often do not feel they have any legitimacy to comment on it because they're a regional newspaper as opposed to an international newspaper. I guess that was only 3 reasons, but that largely proves our point. The second piece of framing that I'm going to do is that notably when people engage with issues, what is far more important to an individual is what is close to them by things like proximity, which is to say people are far more likely to care about local politics. The guy who chooses to build, a park in the area, or for example, a guy who adjusts the interest rate and the RBA means that people can take out loans in X, Y manner. These things affect people, and therefore they're things which they're far more likely to comment on, far more likely to weigh in on, and far more likely to read about, as opposed to a conflict which happens far away. The third thing then is to say that obviously in both worlds, international and regional news exists. So what we mean by prefer is that we would suggest that we think that on net regional news is better quality, but also we far more prefer people to read more regional news at the expense of international news because we think it is something which is more useful to these individuals and also better quality. Clarification from OO.
Yeah, just to be clear, the first part of your setup seems to imply that the local newspapers would not cover conflicts like
Hey, listen to a fucking speech. I said you will say that Israel-Palestine conflict exists or Biden gets elected. Obviously you make that. We're saying you don't like to make a commentary on it. Listen. The second argument I'm going to make then is what is better, what a single argument, what is better. So first point here is what gets better engagement. The first thing to note here is that you want to understand and you're far more better able to understand and comprehend the concepts, which is say is often more simple. You understand things like cost of living crises. It is often more direct because you know that if X kind of criminal policy gets implemented, it means there's going to be more police in your area, and it's far more concrete because now you know maybe I shouldn't if you decriminalize marijuana, maybe you can now smoke marijuana, etc. All these things directly affect your life, directly affect things you can and cannot do, which therefore means you're far more likely to understand and far more likely want to engage and keep up with these news because these are things which you could get in trouble for if you do not keep up with it. On the contrary here, if you think about the NYT, you're far less likely to understand the concept. And the simple analogy I give to you here is that often when you're not an expert in the subject matter and you read some commentary, you go, holy shit, this person is so smart, they know so many things. But on the contrary here is that when you read an article written within your subject area, you go, wow, this guy's a fucking moron. They don't understand cause and effect. They don't understand the complexities of these issues, and it isn't particularly nuanced. That is how most people feel when they read international news, because most people do not have degrees in international relations. Most people do not understand the complexities of the Israel-Palestine frontline conflict. That is why when people read it, they automatically take in the information without actually engaging with it in a way which is particularly meaningful or form their opinions particularly well. That is the reason as to why you see people understanding cost of living, but falling for things like China's debt trap diplomacy kind of reporting, which occurs in many mainstream newspapers. The second observation I would make here is just that the international focus means that you're unlikely to so that is why people do not engage. The second thing is then, what is embedded quality? And we make the argument that international news is actually substantially worse quality than regional news. The first is because you need to cover a broad scope of issues. It therefore means you're not going into nearly as much detail, which is to say, even if there is some analysis, some countries just simply do not get covered, which is to say Vietnam gets covered maybe every 4 editions because it's not a particularly important country in this world, which therefore means people are unable to get a holistic understanding of what is happening in the situation over a long period of time. Compared to someone just covered local Sydney politics and you know what Chris Minns is getting up to, means you're far more able to understand what is happening in the legislature and the policies which are likely going to be passed and the kind of discussions which are happening, and also what is going on between each of the politicking between each of the benches there. The second thing is that often these international news lack sufficient amounts of insight, which is to say, firstly, to the extent insight, because firstly, often they run through the lens of the place where the newspaper is headquartered, which is to say the Economist is headquartered in the UK, and as a result, report from that particular lens, or because the New York Times is headquartered in New York, report in that particular lens as well. And the reasons for that are simple. Firstly, because often you lack particular connections to be able to, network with particular politicians in these countries, understand what's actually going on, or know how, the wheel is made, essentially, compared to local news, where you probably have contacts with the people in your local MP's office or those in your federal office. The second thing is accountability is often limited as well, which is to say, when you have full coverage of an election far away, no one from Vietnam is writing into the Economist being like, you've covered it incorrectly. Conversely, in this is the Sydney Morning Herald. If you covered something incorrectly, some annoying Karen writes in and goes, you fuck this coverage. This isn't what's actually happening in North Sydney. Kalia Tink isn't actually evil and hates hard solo, etc. These are things which are far more likely to happen when it is local news. The second thing I suggest is that you also get incredibly lazy coverages, particularly homogenous, which say people often view things through the lens of their own country as well. Which say so much coverage in the Economist at NYT is just like the BJP is like the Republicans and the Democrats are actually like the INC. It's particularly silly because they're very different contexts and different ways in which they operate, which cannot be viewed through the lens of US politics. And that these broad brushstrokes is likely to get a far more worse quality and less nuanced view of what news looks like. The third thing, or wherever I'm up to now, also just that mainstream consensus which forms within the news itself is quite awful as well. We say many of these international news galvanize around similar opinions to say that to gain political clout or to have some sort of media consensus, which I point to the example of the debt trap reporting for China, which is that it is totally manufactured, but because all these international sources kind of agreed and referred to each other, it became something which people knew, and that is quite harmful because it is patently false. The last thing to note is that often these news sources run toward a center because they want to pander to a larger audience. The impact of this is very simple. I've explained comparatively why regional news is far more likely to be more accountable, they're far more likely to be accurate, they're far more likely to be more informative and more important to individuals so they actually engage with the issues. The thing to note is that consuming more international news, it is one thing to be uninformed, but it's significantly worse to be misinformed, because this is the people who are likely to make policy. It is the middle class who reads these sources, and that is what actually affects people writ large, and that is an awful harm you ought to avoid in this debate.
All right, thanks to the Prime Minister for that speech. I now welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Just quickly, what was the clarification? We couldn't hear it.
Oh, I was just clarifying some of I don't remember. It was all in Cat's speech. I just misheard something. Yeah.
Okay, don't worry.
Cool. If I take a POI from OO, I'll just kind of state what the POI is before I answer it. So hopefully that should come through. Does that sound good in terms of something that we'll all do so the online teams can hear it? Yeah. Yeah, cool. What's most important in this debate is that the people who read news frequently and who are affected by it, the people whose opinions and voting behavior changes as a result of their news consumption, those people need to understand the global affairs of the world most, because these are the people who determine things like foreign policy that affects whether or not empowered countries do interventions in other countries. The people in those countries getting intervened in do not have any opportunity to control whether that happens, but it's the people who read the news, people who are important in this debate, the people who let it affect how they vote, those are the ones who control huge global events through the way that they vote. Therefore, they should understand those events. And we don't really care that much if they don't understand the complexities of zoning law, or whether Kylie Tink is indeed somebody who is evil and hates Han Solo is in fact an okay woman. So how should you judge this debate? I think it's kind of a weird one, because obviously these two sources just do different things and fill different needs. Probably the easiest thing that you should think about is, if you're thinking about the population of people who kind of generally tend to read news, whether you'd prefer them to start their day with an international paper, whether you'd prefer them to start a local paper, I think is probably just the simplest analogy here. And what we would support on side 00 is that this be the primary component of people's media diet. Obviously, we can still support people going to local coverage if they have a specific need to do so. Obviously, if somebody reads about something in an international paper that is something that is locally relevant to them, we would support them then going afterwards and reading local coverage of that to deepen their understanding if they want to do so. I think this is a very reasonable way to think about the debate. The last thing I would clarify is just that I think the info slide kind of weirdly implies that international coverage is all kind of ideologically same, like they're like the NYT and the Guardian. Obviously, we also support things like The Economist, we support the Wall Street Journal. There's a lot of ideological diversity in this space, and there's a lot of global diversity too. For instance, we also have the BBC, we also have Al Jazeera as well. So I think that that should hopefully give a bit more nuance to what the op case in this debate ought to be. Let's talk then about why quality of information is particularly important in this debate, and what type of information we think people need to have. The first thing to say here is that on 00, we just prefer a world where people have an accurate understanding of what's going on at the national and international level. Local issues are important to the individuals who read the news, like to their quality of life. You know, it's important for you to know the bin cycle. It's important for you to know zoning laws. It's important to know about things like speed cameras. But what is really important in this debate is that this is not an actor debate. And there's no particular reason why we should care about the harm of people not knowing what the bin cycle is in their local community, more than we should care about those people making uninformed decisions when it comes to whether to vote for a government that's hawkish on China or a government that's dovish on China. And I think that you ought to care more about the global consequences of populations of people who are informed by the news and allow it to change how they vote. Those people who are highly educated swing voters ought to have the most accurate information, because they're the ones who drive these types of global events that affect billions, sometimes billions of people. That is clearly far more important. And if that comes at the cost of those people having a somewhat strange understanding of what the local level policy is in their area, that is harm that we will happily accept at side opening opposition. We don't think it's very salient to those people as a rule. The second thing to talk about then is that I also think that often international coverage and your understanding of how events take place on the global sphere, by looking at things like the most internationally relevant examples of stories, still inform how people think about ideology and still inform about how people then do vote at the local level. So that doesn't really take away from their ability to represent their interests, because often the way that you form an ideology and you form an understanding of politics is about reading a series of stories about how different political lenses have been applied to solve situations, and then thinking about whether the solutions were ones that were good or bad. That's something that you can get whether you read local stories or international stories. But if we prove that international stories are generally less biased, generally more fact-based and higher quality in their coverage, then that would mean that people would be able to form a more accurate understanding of who serves their interest, what type of ideology, what type of party they ought to vote for. And that, I think, is also a benefit to those individual newsreaders in this debate that probably again outweighs whether they understand local level politics or whether they don't understand that specific policy. As long as they can generally actualize their ideological preferences, that probably translates well enough along. So that, I think, is fine. The last thing to talk about then is that we think that ultimately on our side, if we get people to have a better understanding of what's happening in the global sphere, that is something that likely translates into better empathy, better understanding of what those global events are, which again means that higher quality decisions get made when those people decide what types of parties to vote for. This is a debate fundamentally about the actions of the people who are most empowered in the world. It is a debate about the actions of people who are highly educated, the people who read news, take it on board, and who allow it to affect their opinions. That is the actor that we care about influencing the most in that debate, because that actor has such immense power over the way the rest of the world functions and how people are affected by it. Let's then talk about why it is that this is likely to be much higher quality information in the international paper on our side. We have, I think, about 5 main reasons. The first one is about competition. The second one is that this is relatively less biased because it is more distant from local events, to the point that those things get covered in both. We prefer people to read the international version. There's greater accountability. There's better staff because there's more prestige and more of an incentive to want to work, and there's more diverse staff. So let's get into the details on why all of those reasons are true. Firstly, on competition and why it's much better at the international level. But before I do, I'll take closing.
All of the benefits are contingent on people believing this news. Why was that likely the case, considering conspiratorial narratives about why they were all corrupt big establishments?
Cool. So I think, honestly, the type of person who is prone to conspiracy theories is probably the type of person who doesn't read either local news or international news. They read things like conspiracy papers. They read things like internet forums, and they get their news from like random people posting it on Reddit. I honestly just don't really think that person is in the debate. But if we do think about which of these things is likely to be seen as more legitimate or more influential, it's probably the one that has an international brand, that's subject to better accountability, that's more competitive, that has more prestige attached to its name in general. And so that is fine, and I think important in this debate. Let's talk about competition. The first thing to understand here is that there's an extremely large market for global news. This is about the educated people across every country in the world who consume these papers generally. And what is important there is that these people also have quite a large amount of money, and they value information very highly. So they're much more likely to spend larger amounts of money on their subscriptions. That means then that international papers exist in a far more competitive marketplace than local ones can. And if you look at local coverage, it usually does look like, for instance, if we're talking about newspapers that serve a single city or a single town or region, you have the left-wing one and you have the right-wing one. And that's kind of it. But if you think about the international marketplace, you have kind of the British lens of the BBC, the American lens of the NYT, but it's the American progressive lens, the American right-wing lens of the Wall Street Journal. You have Al Jazeera, which is incredibly global in its reach as well. And you have a number of different kind of like people from different countries who work for these papers, which all means then that you can have a far greater representation of different lenses, ideologies, and of course competition that happens across accuracy and across serving particular areas. So for instance, some of these papers might focus more on Africa, others might focus more on Asia, depending on the interests of their particular readership base. What that means then is that we prefer people to consume any single individual one of these papers, because that higher level of competition that's enabled by the larger marketplace means that they're more likely to have competition around having less ideological bias, more accurate information, and so on. The second thing is that they're more distant from local events, which is good because it means that those writers are more likely to have an objective lens. They're less likely to feel like they have a stake in it, and they're less likely to be informed by local biases that shape how they report because they're not from that area, so they can look at things in a more clear-eyed way. That is good because if you are more accurate information when you first read the international paper, it inoculates you against disinformation or poor information that might later happen in local news when you go on to do deeper research. So this forms people's first impressions in a far better way. At the end of the day, this is more prestigious, it's higher quality as a result of that, you have greater accountability, also because it's so large and so visible and there's competition. For those reasons, far prefer international news.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for that speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Oh, can everyone hear me? Opening opposition hinges their case on a lie. And that lie is the notion that the brief caricature of complex and deep-seated conflict or political dispute in another country that you read about in a 10-minute article on The Guardian or the New York Times actually gives you insight into what is going on, actually means that you have a right to interfere in what is going on in that country, but it doesn't. It's frequently wrong, it's frequently unnuanced, it frequently lacks context, it frequently misattributes cause and effect, frequently takes one side or views the issue through the lens of the Western country from which you are from. It views one side as a good Western party and the other side as a bad evil party. It implies that, for example, the BJP are the Republicans of India and that the Congress is the Democrats. None of these things are true, and we would contend on side opening government that the most dangerous thing in this debate is a little bit of information, or worse yet, misinformation, which is exactly what opening opposition would have you do. Firstly, I'm going to delete their main way to winning the debate, which suggests that this will keep the professional middle class informed about global issues and therefore serve as an accountability mechanism on sort of the dangers of various international policy disasters that might otherwise occur, I'll then whip all the remaining material we give to take the debate for opening government. So, what must you believe for opening opposition's argument to work? Firstly, you must believe that this actually results in an informed populace as a result of reading these papers. Kat gives you a whole host of unresponded to material as to why the coverage that these papers give is likely to be incredibly poor. The fact that often you get very limited coverage on many countries because they only pop up every third issue or so. The fact that you have to cover so many countries means that the depth of coverage on any one country tends to be low. The fact that often the type of coverage is lazy and is homogenous. What do we hear in response? We are told that there are 5 mechanisms. There are in fact 3. Mechanism 1 is that there is competition. Problem with this is fourfold. Firstly, it implies that people would ever switch between newspapers in order to create a competitive marketplace. This is highly unlikely. Firstly, because there are often very substantial costs involved in signing up to one paper, like New York Times, The Economist, so that creates a disincentive to leaving that particular service. But secondly, because often the news you consume is tied deeply to your identity, like you are a Guardian reader, or you are a New York Times reader, or you're an Economist reader. It's not just like a tool you utilize to be informed about the world. It defines who you are ideologically and how it is that you conceive of yourself, which is why you're very unlikely to engage in fact-checking and believe that the source of news that you read in and that you identify with is wrong in the first place. Secondly, though, we'd point out that the way in which lazy coverage occurs tends to be relatively homogenous. For example, it tends to be all Western newspapers engaging in Western framing of issues that occur in other countries, or else it tends to be things like concocting wholesale narratives that tend to be convenient to the class that owns the media in general. For example, the existence of Chinese debt trap diplomacy, because it's easy to play on narratives of xenophobia to sell papers, not because that is in fact something that ever existed. But thirdly, we point out that in general, there's likely to be a broad lack of accountability on these papers, because who is it that's going to call them out? The vast majority of people who read these papers are in the West and have no idea that anything is wrong, and no real way to find out that anything is wrong, because all the other papers say the same thing. But finally, we suggest that the vast majority of people only read one newspaper, so even if there were other papers calling them out, why would they know about those call-outs? Why would they be aware? So competition doesn't work. Secondly, they say these papers are more distant, therefore less biased, also less informed, right? Because they're not in that country. They don't really know what's going on. This seems like a very unintuitive mechanism. Finally, they say there's a wide diversity of authors involved. Well, like one, probably not. Like The Economist hires a lot of different authors, but presumably all of the coverage for any one particular topic area comes from one person. Secondly, a regional newspaper obviously has a far greater diversity because everyone writes about relatively similar issues. So you can hire a broad number of, for example, differing political perspectives within the one paper. You can have things like editorial and have things like opinion columns where you get a wider variety of opinions there. So those mechanisms are flipped, and you ought not believe that this coverage is informed. If you believe that people are misinformed, you ought then believe that this team actually invokes harm, because people have a misunderstanding of how the world operates, and they determine policy should occur on that basis. They support things that are otherwise bad, and they have bad policy as a result. Secondly, even if you believe people are well-informed, you must believe that they actually have a capacity to affect global events as a result of what they read in these particular papers. We'd point out that one, most people have many issues they need to vote on, and they're far more likely to vote on issues like their own cost of living, the economy, political issues that occur in their country, not something like that is occurring on the other side of the world. Secondly, there's limited political parties. What if neither the Republicans or the Democrats support doing the thing you to have a vote that means anything? And finally, there's no reason to believe politicians actually follow through on anything. They break their promises all the time. Finally, is there any reason to believe any of this has a good result? Think about the kinds of things that the NYT have called for in the past. It's things like we should invade Iraq in 2003. It's things like we should pull out of Afghanistan. It's things like we should support Israel right now. What reason is there given as to why these are the correct stances, or that these would be useful stances in any particular way? Closing opposition.
International newspapers like Al Jazeera are not only Western owned, and you haven't proved that they are, but even if they're only delivering basic knowledge, knowing that two countries are at war with one another is relevant information that voters have a right to.
Well, it's unfortunate you didn't listen to Kat's speech, because she explains that even domestic coverage is likely to contain the factual information that two countries are at war, but not the editorial that is a distorting part. So that actually flips against you. But secondly, we would say that the vast majority of Western readers do not read Al Jazeera, and I provide a number of mechanisms as to why that is unlikely. So you're in a difficult position in this debate. Let's then weigh what we have here against what opening opposition has standing left against what we prove. Firstly, we provide a whole heap of framing as to why what really matters in this debate is local news. And don't let opening opposition fool you here by suggesting that this is about like bin routes or something. Local news includes federal news. Local news includes state news. Read the info slide about what this debate is about. Obviously, federal policy matters far more to individuals than, for example, what occurs on the other side of the world, for 3 effects. Firstly, things that happen near to you affect you more. Things like state governments control education, healthcare, policing. Federal governments control things like taxation. Obviously, an economic policy, far more bigger effect on your life than international events. Two, it's more proximate and understandable. So even if it had an effect, the capacity of you to actually engage with it and understand it is limited compared to something that is within your personal experience and you can fact check and engage back and forth with. But thirdly, it's something you could actually control. Tax policy in your country, policing in your country, healthcare in your country was something you could do something about. You could not solve Israel-Palestine as an individual person, and it was ludicrous to think that you could, which explains exactly why the benefits we provide are so important. Because on our side, far more people are informed than on theirs. Their best case is that the professional managerial class reads The Economist. Our best case is that the vast majority of people read a local newspaper, are better informed, know more about what is occurring around them, and as a result are able to make important decisions. And these things mattered. It was things like robo-debt, it was things like corruption, it was things like disenfranchisement of their citizens, it was things like tax policy, welfare, redistribution, things that actually mattered and actually made people's lives far better. We helped far more people. We made them actually informed. Contrast that to an opposition bench that must defend a caricature of misinformation and smug people going around thinking they understand the developing world when they do not, and making things far, far worse.
All right, thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. And I welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Robo-debt was in The Guardian. It was in the BBC. It was in a variety of international newspapers, because the key false comparative this opening government team sets up is to say that the most critical information that could be relevant to anyone within this country would not be reported on in international news. Clearly, this is not the case. By their own characterization, they suggest they want to dedicate airtime to as many countries as possible and deal with the most pressing issues in either circumstance, which means that the benefits this opening government team espouses just are so symmetric. It is necessarily the set of information that is particularly tangential to the meaningful impact to people's lives, because were it truly important at the scale of the international factors we will discuss in this speech, it would already be in that international newspaper. So they get the section of the news they have to defend wrong in this debate. And I think necessarily that means they cannot come very far. Firstly, let's talk on the issue of quality. We do provide you with 5 mechanisms at Jordyn to explain why it is the case that this is a mode of competition and quality enforcement that is likely to be particularly good. The main response we get from Udai is just to suggest that maybe it's the case that the way in which this competition is likely to occur is probably particularly bad, but that's on the basis of cost of subscription or tying your own careful political identity. Firstly, we'll just make the observation that much of news nowadays is like free on social media. People don't politically closely identify with the given newspaper. It's more likely that they have an ideology and might consume a range of global perspectives from that newspaper. But even if you buy everything they say, like, just be comparative. People in Sydney also have close ideological ties to things like the Sydney Morning Herald or being an Australian reader. Clearly, it is the case that that political allegiance is likely to be symmetric on both grounds. The unique difference in this debate, though, is under our side, at least those global papers are more likely to have some form of diversity, whether that's necessarily through hiring, through the vast expanse of options available to you, through the fact that most people tend to consume news nowadays through social media, where you would go through the marketplace of ideas and identify the best individual articles from each newspaper. Their team necessarily has a hiring pool which is constrained to one city, where all the internal historical ideological factors of the people in that city are internalized within the bias of that paper. Clearly, on the metric of objectivity, then our side is particularly winning. The second claim we hear is this idea that, well, maybe it's the fact that this reporting is less locally dense because they have to cover more countries, and sometimes it might relate to local dynamics inappropriately. The first observation we would make is just like, the harm here is circular. Like, if it's the case that it's less locally dense, maybe that's just because it's covering the most important material and not the wide lineage of other useless shit that those newspapers tend to cover. But on the matter of sometimes relating to local dynamics inappropriately, we would observe in the first instance that, yes, maybe this is unfortunate, but the reason it is done is because it is the most efficient way to communicate that information to the people of the primary reader base of that international newspaper, which is why there's often a lot of close relationships to the US government, maybe it's an imperfect proxy, but it is a proxy that far outweighs the alternative of requiring individuals to understand the complex nuances of the Indian political system in a way that we think would be particularly inaccessible on the comparative. But even if you still think this is a harm, just be comparative with the way local newspapers would do this, where they tie international events to things like local politics, to instances in their local history and local cultural context in a way that we think is probably overwhelmingly quite symmetric, but we think, probably just eventuates all the harm, even insofar as you believe there exists. Compare all of these objections Side Open Government has to the vast variety of material Jordyn explains to you about the fact that because these newspapers are larger, the reward for going to take them down and calling them out when they get things wrong is so much larger for your own prestige. The fact that the staff hiring pool necessarily is substantially of a higher quality, not just through the lens of diversity, but because many of these international newspaper institutions have long histories of lineage and prestige associated with them, which means we get the best reporters under our side, the people who are most capable of processing the most nuanced forms of argument. I think it is clear that at least on the quality of the reporting, Side Opening opposition has clearly won this issue. That mechanizes our win then, because I think Jordyn clearly frames why it's the case that that quality of reporting is something which is so critical to this debate, is something that means that those people are actually internalize the best forms of action. And don't listen to, when he says, well, it's difficult for people to vote, it's difficult for people to campaign. Yeah, maybe that is the case, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile doing. It doesn't mean that the action that's generated from those forms of action is not particularly useful. It's obviously untrue that governments don't care about electoral incentives. Like, the direction in which those giant actions shape on people's lives and encourage them to go out and do those forms of action is particularly critical in this debate, and what we would suggest is probably the most high impact lens. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
The incentives of these organizations was to unlock new international markets. Why was that trajectory not one of neutrality and not being able to make these types of political comments?
So we think in the first instance that it just is not true that these perspectives would necessarily, in every circumstance, be kind of like at the objective flat neutral level both gov teams describe. Like, even in local markets, for example, we would suggest that the personality profile of people who become local journalists are probably particularly ideologically bent, would be particularly likely to engage in those forms of commentary anyways. Like, they have a platform, they have a personality profile that encourages them to make takes about local government on that platform. It's so unclear why this will not equally translate to international politics, especially when, I think your opening seems to concede that they tend to make conflations between those two ideas. Deeply unclear why this is an asymmetric harm on both sides. Let's move then to the second issue of this debate on local connection. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is just to explain why those forms of macro action Jordyn explains to you are still particularly important for people on the ground. The first observation we would make is that people are just overwhelmingly more affected by those large-scale affairs. So, for example, people probably care much more about fuel prices in terms of the direct impact to their lives than things like a local council election. Because yes, maybe that local council election will pass bylaws, maybe it won't, but that fuel price will, take money out of their pockets, make their quality of living so much substantially worse. And that is something which we uniquely are able to provide to you under our side of the house, because even if you believe opening government's characterization at their most uncharitable, maybe they can factually explain the circumstances that are occurring, but they would suggest journalists in their world would be unwilling to provide meaningful commentary. Clearly, that is something which only happens under opening opposition, where we are actually able to meaningfully explain the impact of those consequences, the direction people in a given country or even globally should feel about these issues. And I think that's a particularly important guide for when addressing these significant macroeconomic factors that shape the way people live their lives in the long term. That clearly is very high impact. But even if you don't think this is true, we think we still win on a basis of timescale, because maybe that local newspaper will eventually get to reporting when the fuel prices go up. But we would suggest that's too late. That's going to come as a huge economic shock to people on the ground. Our team uniquely, when analyzing those larger structural factors, is able to provide advanced warning before that shock hits. The final observation we would make is just that weigh all of this material about local dynamics and things on the ground to what Jordyn explained to you about global empathy and understanding, and encouraging those policymakers to take some of the largest, more radical forms of change that exist in this debate to meaningfully improve conditions, not just for that sector of newsreaders, but for people all over the world. And I think it's clear that on the scale of that impact alone, it is a clear 0-0 victory.
All right, I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and welcome the government member to begin the closing half of the debate.
I guess we can just kind of pass the laptop and
yeah, POIs in chat. Good luck to you for figuring out how to do it. I'm going to start this speech with what I think is just a fairly reasonable observation about what both of these outlets probably report on, which is to say that obviously they report on international news that is newsworthy in either world. If World War III breaks out, then probably the Sydney Morning Herald reports on it, in much the same way that the Sydney Morning Herald reported on Israel-Palestine, just the same as the BBC. The notable difference here is that the BBC didn't tell Australians how to check for their exposure to robo-debt the way that the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald did, because that specific news outlet did not have an incentive to do so. It is a completely unreasonable conception from this opposition bench that no national newspaper would ever report on anything that is internationally newsworthy. I think it goes against the empirical reality of the way that these outlets behave. I'm going to do two things for you in the speech after some points of extraneous rebuttal. The first substantive contribution will be about how we uniquely enable people to trust in the news and therefore disempower misinformation and conspiracy at its outset. The second thing I'm going to explain to you is why national and regional news uniquely is able to compete with online misinformation that is algorithmically targeted. Firstly, then, a couple of extraneous responses to opening opposition. Jordyn tells you that this debate is exclusively about knowing the bin cycle in regional areas versus understanding Biden's stance on China or whether two countries are at war from a wide range of ideologically positioned international newspapers. A couple of responses here. The first thing to say is that simply, this motion is about national and regional newspapers. It is entirely unclear to me why United States-based national papers do not report on the latter for the precise political reasons that Jordyn describes. It is entirely unclear why they do not have an incentive to do so. The second thing that I would note is that obviously there are actually just some national and regional issues that are more salient. For example, I would posit that it is more important for white Australians to know about Indigenous deaths in custody here than it is to know the intensive, intimate details of African American deaths in custody in the United States, because that is how they are able to realize political action that can be meaningful in Australia. The last thing that I would say here is, as Sierra flags in a point of information, the growth incentive of international news outlets is to unlock as many international markets and readers as they possibly can, which means that their trajectory is towards neutrality. That is why you see a softening of the stance towards, for example, Saudi Arabia by traditionally left-leaning international news outlets, for example, news outlets like Vice or news outlets like The Guardian, because they are no longer able to take on hardcore policy positions if they want to unblock those international markets. And I think that that probably neutralizes the vast majority of this formation of strong policy positions material that you hear from this opening opposition bench. On to conspiracy formation then. And I would simply note at the top of this point that obviously there is actually just growing general disillusionment with mass media, and the prominent mechanism for that disillusionment is international news outlets that appear to be faceless and that confirm people's fears of conspiracy. How does conspiracy form? The first thing to say here is that your insulation from conspiracy is predicate on your ability to understand what is happening, which is to say that distance and obfuscation from the people who are providing you with information means that you are inherently more likely to distrust it. The second thing that I would say is that people have been historically primed to believe that other countries are attempting to propagandize against them. The third thing I would say is that there is sometimes simply adversarial rhetoric and positioning. For example, telling you that you should care much more about people at home than you should care about people overseas. The fourth thing I would say is that obviously a lot of conspiracy is predicate specifically on there being an obscured conspiratorial actor. This is often heightened by cultural schism or not understanding the people who are giving you that information. The last thing to say here is that obviously news is always things that are noteworthy, not empathy-inducing. News often reports on things like terrorist attacks. It often reports on things that will actually heighten cultural tension. I think it is untrue that news reports on happy, clappy things that make people feel good. Why was this uniquely bad in the way that people interacted with international news outlets? The first thing to say was that often the content in these international news outlets, whether it was true or nuanced or not, was often just not reflective of individual consumers' everyday lives. The second thing to say here was that often they just reported on things that people deemed to not be particularly important because they were geographically removed, because they didn't feel relevant. The third thing to say is that often people did have that perceived adversarial relationship with other states, for example, immense Euroscepticism, that meant that they were likely to perceive international news outlets that appeared to be somewhat sympathetic to those actors as extensions of that. The third thing to say is that the obscured conduct or backing of those news outlets often appeared to reinforce conspiratorial theories about elites running international news. The fifth thing to say is that often the homogeneity of the similar profit structures of these outlets meant that they just pushed out quite similar content, which, if you were already distrustful of these kind of news outlets, made you distrust them even more. The fifth thing to say was that they had a unique relationship with political establishments. For example, politicians writing op-eds in The Guardian that made you distrustful of those relationships. We also just think that people are often skeptical of large entities. What that meant was that often people were just immensely distrustful of these international news sources, regardless of whether what they were reporting on was actually true or not. And as a result, they were immensely susceptible to misinformation. Before I talk about the comparative, I'll take a point from opening.
Do you think people would be so distrustful of what we describe as being extremely high quality international outlets that are able to get people to engage in international affairs in a way that they would otherwise be kind of utterly divorced from, if it were not for the fact that local news, which is poor quality, often does do things like conspiracy theories directly?
I think that often people are actually just immensely distrustful of anything that they perceive as being alien or beyond their immediate scope of reference. And I think that even if perhaps sometimes national news does things that are bad or reports in bad ways, people are much more inherently positioned to trust it because it is national, because it maps onto the inherent trust of the national interest that people are often raised to believe or propagandized to believe. And as a result, they are just much more likely to trust it. Why then was that so uniquely good? The first thing to say here is that people were just more likely to trust incredibly important information that was likely to come from these news sources, whether that was things like health alerts or dates of elections or how they ought vote, like literally mechanistically how voting worked. The second thing to say here was just that people were likely to engage significantly more. That was likely to engender discourse. When weighing this over our opening, note that we explain that conspiracy theory is uniquely disempowered on our side. Even if it's a small group of people who subscribe to these conspiracy theories, I would know that they can simply exert immense damage. Lastly, then, on competing with algorithmic misinformation, I would note that whether you are trustful or distrustful of these news sources, people engage with algorithmically targeted news content from non-fact check outlets that is generated for them through algorithms that know where you live, that know your content preferences, and that know your other characteristics. Local news is uniquely able to compete with these metrics for a couple of reasons. The first thing is that it's focused on your geographical location, which is to say the same metrics as algorithmically targeted content. The second thing was it happened in linear tandem, which is to say they were literally reporting on the same things. The third is that it could actively correct for misinformation. When you weigh this, we explain how individuals directly interact with news beyond just the which newspaper do you read clash of the opening half. We explain how you interact with social media as well as news media, and the way that this kind of media is uniquely able to disempower misinformation within that sphere, we were incredibly proud to propose.
All right, I thank government member for that speech and welcome the member for opposition. I'm going to pause the recording now.
I'll take the rise from the chat, please. I think Sierra tries to dismiss the plausibility of our case by intuition pumping about the fact that conspiratorial people were always conspiratorial and just had some fixed amount of craziness. But obviously it was the case that governments throughout history have been able to mobilize people for persecution, have been able to make people believe things about other people that weren't particularly true, and then do violent things or particularly just act in perhaps apathetic ways. I think that this debate actually occurs in a way that you have to protect yourself against the competition from social media that is able to have the type of regional algorithmic tuning that means that the news you're likely to get is likely to be particularly misinformation, is likely to be disinformation, that is likely to fuel all of those things in perverse manners. But secondly, we give you the characterization at Rose that is not sufficiently responded to, that is to say that people are disillusioned by the perception that these huge entities do not care about them, that there are mutual exclusivities between funding domestic citizens and funding Ukraine. Why should I hear about the suffering of people abroad when I myself am suffering? That is the unique analysis of mutual exclusivity that does not appear in our opening. That is why you engender that that degree of hostility, that is why people actually don't engage. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to deal with the extension that we get from CO about these international institutions being better. Secondly, I'm going to deal with the extension that we bring you with respect to conspiracy, why we get more engagement. And then I'm actually going to mechanize that in the benefits in terms of social media and also what you can do with that, specifically talking about gerrymandering in this debate. On that first point then about international institutions, they tell you they're less precarious because they have more stable revenue streams. I've noted a couple of things here. And so far as they identify that sometimes when you do things that are important or report in things that are important, you have to be a prominent institution. You have to probably, in some instances, draw the center of governments. I would just note here that it is probably good to not have the centralization of the entire news capacity be within like specific international organizations, even if it is the case that local and regional organizations do not do a lot of reporting internationally, do not engage in direct regime criticism or trying to make those kind of broad geopolitical considerations. It is probably still better then that the government does not target them during times of repression. You can still keep the lights on to report on things like water quality, to report on things like where to go in times of crisis. But that is a unique benefit that accrues to us insofar as we have this as the norm. But we would just note that secondly, right, and this is kind of tying in what we hear at OO, which is to say that they get more interventions. I would note here that this characterization of why it is that you actually care is not sufficiently proven. That is for the proximate considerations that likely outshadow this, but I would note that the specific analysis that we extend of our opening is the fact that those 2 things are considered as being mutually exclusive, because it was not clear at that point, at their point in the debate, why it was the case you could not care about 2 things at the same time. We told you that those 2 things were directly in tension insofar as funding narratives from conservatives and people who wanted to run contractionary budgets painted this as such. But secondly, we would note that the way in which these international institutions had to make this seem salient and relevant to you was to lapse the gamut in proximity by making it appear something that was really, really serious, which is to say that if something is happening right next to me, the implications to me are very obvious, but if something is happening far away, you need to fill in that gap with other things like potentially inflammatory language, or just like inflating the magnitude of that potential impact. I think that was unlikely to be coherent with things like fostering empathy and demystifying people who lived abroad. Unlikely, specifically for the reason also that we give you a rose, which is to say that you report on the news not when people hold hands and do like general fun things, but when bad things happen. But I just think that lastly here, in terms of prioritization and OO's ability to unlock any benefits, I think it's a really important observation that even if they do prove that people care, that people know this information well, it is unlikely what changes. And this is particularly for the reason that they characterize these international institutions as being stable, neutral, and good. If that is the case and they just kind of have chilling with the waves of the neoliberal order, what are they introducing that is going to significantly change the minds and sentiments of these voters? What would that change at the point at which those voters went to vote? But I would just note secondarily that even if it is the case that they add something new to the populace, add new sentiments, their ability to go and vote on those considerations was directly contingent on the amount of security that they felt at home. If you felt that your neighborhood was precarious, you probably felt that the international community was, even if the reporting you got was really, really passive, you probably scaled up all of those types of harms and risks that you perceive to exist broadly. That was a reason for why you did not have a particularly altruistic spirit or spending capacity. Next, then, what do we hear about? Next, then, what do we hear about why they get better institutions on the opposition bench? They tell us like broadly they're good and they're better because they like have more like oversight, they have like better institutions, better know-how. We would just note that probably the reasons for us why these local and national and regional ones work better is because they actually exist within those communities. That is a particular type of expertise that perhaps isn't attained at a university, but knowing someone on a personal level, knowing the jokes they like, knowing how to communicate them with them in a way that is engaging, knowing the stories they like to come back again to listen to is a direct means of understanding the profitability, probably just allows you to be engaged for more, such that even if you only get to do a little bit of international news under our side of the house, the amount of engagement is relatively larger, such that you probably get it better under our side. And the fact that it doesn't come with all of those corollary harms of perceiving this as some kind of propagandizing entity that wants to like establish some international order, even if that is more tacitly just an entity that wants you to spend money that should go to domestic citizens on issues that are abroad and abstract. Next, then, on our extension on conspiracy, why this was particularly important. We told you at Rose that the ability to actually perceive something as being a conspiracy was hedged against your ability to go out into the real world and then fact check that. You could not fact check the extent to which other people being characterized as being nefarious actors. You could fact check the extent to which like your local school board was being characterized as being bad if you could actually walk into that building. That was incredibly good if that was the majority of the reporting, probably mitigated against those things. But secondly, it was the fact that the manifestation of that conspiratorial thinking came directly from the prominence of these international institutions. That was to say they were the majority. It reinforced narratives of a majoritarian order. I would take a QI from OO.
Why is it that the educated elite class who read the news and who change their votes on the basis of it would ever care about either themselves donating to crises abroad or pushing their governments to intervene in them if they only read the local paper?
Well, I think it's the case, like, it's not only the educated and wealthy that donate. Like, a lot of people in current instances of international crises were not particularly rich. But I think that secondly, even if it is the case that they need to like know this to like do it, they probably still know it to some extent under our side of the house. It probably just doesn't look like repetitive and like looking into the intricacies of like cluster munitions. It probably just looks like broad headlines like what we tell you at Rose that probably still understand or explain it. Next, what do we tell you under our side about conspiracies? I will just note here that this is really bad because conspiratorial actors do not need to necessarily be mobile in votes. They can just pollute the well of discourse. They can just shift the tones of discourse. They can just be bad to minorities in a way that is particularly harmful for everyone living within that country. But secondly, on what we tell you about social media, your unique necessity to insulate yourself from other actors like social media institutions. The fact that they spread out disinformation locally that could not be corrected because social media entities did not have the incentive to have like a good regulation of that content. They had overriding profit incentives for simply viewership and virality. The meant that they could not overlap the linguistic barriers to like mend sectarian conflicts. It was obviously good if you had something that could correct misinformation directly because you could target the specific populaces. That directly stops violence, that directly stops misinformation. That's a direct mechanism to talk to the people that are affected by social media disinformation recently. So proud to propose.
All right, I thank Government Whip for that speech and welcome Opposition Whip to conclude the debate.
I assume that I'm audible. CO, then CG, then OG. Firstly, CO. We bring you two extensions. Neither gets anything near a sufficient response. Firstly, we say that international papers are vastly better for journalists who get money and protection, who get better and more stable work. And I want to weigh this as to why it wins us the debate. It is both the least symmetric and the highest impact argument brought by any team. Firstly, we would observe that many factors influence the way people vote, whether or not they join conspiratorial beliefs on both domestic and foreign policy, including many of the phenomena identified by the government bench, things like gerrymandering, things like status quo bias. Whereas things like the hiring structure of the organization you work for, money for salaries and superannuation, protection when you are reporting, the likelihood of working as a freelancer or on a contract are caused almost exclusively by the question of this debate. The second thing I'd observe is this is vastly more important for journalists than the other impacts that other teams attempt to claim, because journalism is a dangerous job in many places. It's an incredibly important job everywhere, and it's an industry characterized by increasing precarity, in part because of the changes that this gov bench supports, pushed against by international news outlets. We get insufficient response to this claim, which cuts above any of the political back and forth we hear from the other three teams. So, secondly, what do we tell you on resources and the quality of journalism? And I want to note firstly what opening opposition brings you on the question of resources. They say that international papers have more money than local papers because they have an educated and wealthy readership. This line of analysis is insufficient in this debate for a number of reasons. The first thing we note is that they do not explain resources per reader and per story, which they need in order to get the benefit of good reporting on the stories they put out. But secondly, the briefness of this line of analysis from opening opposition simply cannot justify the massive increase in quality of journalism, which we claim, investigative journalism, journalism in depth, journalism in places that are politically dangerous, that is firstly necessary to overcome opening government's concerns about, for instance, local expertise being a countervailing factor why you might prefer local news. Secondly, that is necessary to fund the highly expensive endeavors, like, for instance, investigative reporting that we described. And thirdly, they simply do not explain at opening what exactly international papers do that makes them distinct and special, which is not only about money, but it's also just about practice, which we identify at Daniel. Things like, for instance, investigative and long-term reporting. And it also, finally, overcomes the symmetry of some of opening opposition's mechanisms, things like competition as government identifies. And then, firstly, gets us the benefit that every team wants in this debate, which is good and politically consequential reporting, and it's analysed in the depth necessary to credit those very ambitious arguments only at one team, which is closing opposition. Let's deal then, secondly, with closing government. They bring us, oh, my phone's dead, sorry. I have yours.
I'm be timing you.
Sorry, can someone put a timestamp in the chat, please? And can my time be? Oh, thanks, Udai, you're a legend. Okay. So secondly, then on closing government, they make a few claims on quality. Oh, you look so cartoonish. Thank you very much. They make a few claims on quality. The first thing they say is that people trust national news more than they trust news from other countries because national news is less scary and less foreign. The first thing I'd observe is that this is rebutted clearly by our extension when we explain that international outlets both are and seem trustworthy, so you cannot credit the material brought by them. But secondly, I'd observe that this is in many ways a very dangerous extension for closing government. Because where local news is politicized or conspiratorial or false, the harm is greater because of their own analysis, which is that people trust that news more. They are less critical of it than they would be of international sources. And that is extremely likely, not only because of our extension that explains that comparative is preferable, less false, less politicized, and so on, but also because national news is uniquely bad. It gets money from division locally. Often it's owned by local elites. It's particularly easy to politicize in a way that international news is not. It's more easily bought out by corporations because those organizations are smaller, because they are less prestigious in that way. But I note fourthly that the observation they make that national news outlets also report on international issues indicates that you, for instance, get more racism, get more fear-mongering where those international issues are reported domestically. But finally, they cannot spin this extension into a benefit. The benefit they claim is so modest that it's unclear how trust in the news does anything special here at all. They say maybe you trust information more about how to vote. People who think that voting is a scam in countries that are democracies where voting is not a scam do not read or at least do not believe the news on either side. It is incredibly unclear how they're able to overcome conspiratorial thinking in any case that is in any way high impact. The second claim they make on quality is that local news is less algorithmic, and that is somehow a good thing. The first thing to observe is that that is in many ways a problem, if you believe it's a problem, with social media that is the delivery platform for news rather than the outlet itself. It's true that maybe, for instance, Facebook gives you kind of an algorithm of the sort of news that it thinks you like or not. That is true for local or international. But secondly, getting news algorithmically delivered to you is fine if the quality of all of that news is higher, which is what we provide you at closing opposition, which is to say, maybe you get some articles that are to do with your interests. All of those articles are better researched and more likely to be true. But finally, I'd observe that this just symmetricizes at the point at which an algorithm, after you've clicked on multiple news stories from one outlet, whether that is national or international, just feeds multiple of those stories back to you, or is more likely to give you information from that news source. So that doesn't stand in the debate. Closing government, I think, is out. Before I move on, opening.
Yeah, if this debate requires a trade-off in consumption, you lose accessibility and coverage of the most important news, local news. If not, you don't have extra money, so you don't pay employees better or are not better able to afford investigative journalism, which is true.
No, so we think that, for instance, the most important local issues people broadly engage with anyway, like people are able to engage in their own community for many of the reasons you described, that people care about local issues. No analysis is provided by this government bench as to why you're able to do that, and we give mechanisms at Daniel as to why these papers are particularly well resourced, whether this debate is comparative or not. So finally then, oh sorry, could you put the timer back up? I'm so sorry, thank you. Finally then, dealing with opening government. I want to note firstly that their argument largely relies on a caricature of international newspapers as both Western owned and having, thanks Trotter, and having their resources spread thin, and that is rebutted, I think, pretty neatly and defeated by our extension. Their only other claim is they observe it might be nice to affect change at home. And I just want to note, one, opening government doesn't really show that domestic news equals domestic political reform. And they say in response to a POI, well, gerrymandering doesn't matter because, you know, people care enough about local issues to overcome it. But that's also not true. There's less consensus on local issues. There is more political division because those issues are more proximate to you. And those things like gerrymandering obviously still do have an effect on domestic politics, or at the very least, they don't prove that then the news they support is necessary if you care about policing, if you care about state politics, and if you have mechanisms to rectify those issues in your state regardless, you will do so. The delta is on international news, which only closing opposition proves with detail sufficient in this debate is better, and the delta is on journalists, which not a single other team in the debate touch, and where the delta and impact is vastly the highest. We win by a mile.